the high-stakes world of the emergency room, where seconds can mean the difference between life and death, there are moments that defy explanation. Nurses and doctors are used to witnessing the unimaginable: car accidents, heart attacks, and the endless string of life or death decisions. But sometimes it's not the physical injuries that haunt them. Sometimes it's the things they can't explain. The shadows that move in empty rooms, the chilling words spoken by unconscious patients, the untraceable calls for help. These are the stories that no one talks about at the nurse's station, the ones that keep you awake long after your shift ends. Welcome to the ER, where reality blurs with the unknown, and not everything you see is what it seems. I still remember the night it happened. It was one of those long shifts, the kind that feels like it'll never end. The ER was its usual self, busy, chaotic, and filled with the sounds of beeping monitors and the occasional shout down the hallway. But just for a moment, everything went quiet. It's like the noise of the world had slipped away, and I was left there, alone with my thoughts. I was at the station, updating patient charts, trying to stay on top of everything. You learn to get used to it, multitasking, constantly on the move, barely taking a breath between tasks. But that night, it felt different. Like something was out of place, though I couldn't tell what it was. And then I saw her. She was walking slowly past the ER bay, her hospital gown barely clinging to her thin frame. She didn't seem in any hurry, just drifting through the hallway, the fluorescent lights casting a dull glow on her face. She had short, disheveled hair, and there was a strange stillness about her. Something about the way she moved. It was almost like she didn't belong there. At first, I thought it was one of our patients, maybe someone who had gotten up without telling anyone. It happens more often than you'd think. So I called out to her, "Ma'am, are you okay?" My voice wasn't loud, but enough to grab her attention, or at least I thought so. But she didn't respond. She didn't even turn around. Instead, she kept walking, heading straight for one of the trauma rooms. I figured, okay, she's disoriented. I got up quickly from my chair and followed her. We've had patients wander off before, and it's usually nothing more than a momentary lapse in judgment. I reached the door just as she disappeared inside the trauma room, and I was about to call out again when, well, I froze. The room was empty. There was no one there. No woman in the hospital gown, no signs that anyone had been in there recently. Just the sterile white walls and the harsh glow of the overhead lights. It's not like we don't check the rooms constantly, especially after every trauma case. But I stood there for a moment, just staring, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was some trick of the light. I told myself that. I convinced myself that it was just my exhaustion playing tricks on me. But then I walked out of the room and toward the security desk. The security footage would clear everything up. They'd seen it all. If the woman had really walked down the hallway and into the trauma room, it would show up on their monitors. So I asked the security officer to pull up the footage, and we both sat there, watching the screen. The camera's view was crystal clear. It showed every inch of the hallway, the doors opening and closing, the nurses and doctors moving about, all in perfect detail. But there was nothing. No woman in the gown, no footsteps. Nothing that could explain what I had just seen with my own eyes. I felt unsettled. I had worked in this hospital long enough to know that things don't always make sense, especially in the ER. We see people at their worst, in ways that are hard to understand or explain. But this was different. It was too real, too present. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just another odd moment in my long career. After all, I'd seen plenty of strange things, but every time I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the image of that woman's face, her vacant stare, the way she walked so purposefully, yet without any awareness of the world around her. Over the next few weeks, I asked around. I spoke with the other nurses, the doctors, even the janitorial staff. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had any idea who the woman might have been or what could have happened that night. It was like she didn't exist at all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she hadn't been a patient. Not in the traditional sense. She wasn't someone I'd seen come in, hadn't been registered at the front desk, and her gown didn't match anything we typically used in the ER. It wasn't one of our standard hospital gowns, and it didn't have a patient ID number sewn into the fabric, like we always do. And that's when the questions started to build up, one after another. If she hadn't been a patient, then who was she? Why did I see her? Why was she there? And why was she alone? It was a quiet thought at first, something I could push aside. But the longer I stayed in the ER, the more I began to feel her presence, like an unspoken weight that hung in the air. And I knew, deep down, that I hadn't imagined it. What I had seen was real. But what did it mean? I never found out. That night, that woman, whoever she was, never came back. She never showed up in the hospital again, and no one mentioned anything that could explain her absence. To this day, I don't know what happened. I can't tell you if she was real or just a fleeting figment of my tired mind. All I know is this. In the ER, you deal with life and death every single day. You see things that can't always be explained. But sometimes, just sometimes, you see something that you can't quite shake. A small piece of something that lingers, even after everything else has passed. Hello friends, thank you for watching. A special shout out to our subscribers. You keep these eerie stories alive. But here's the thing, only 30% of viewers are subscribed. If you enjoy our content, hitting subscribe helps us more than you know. It takes a second, but makes a huge difference. While you're at it, like and share to keep the chills coming. Thanks again. You made this possible. See you in the next one, if you dare. You'd think that after working in the ER for as long as I have, nothing would surprise me anymore. The chaos, the constant rush, the life or death decisions made in the blink of an eye, they become second nature. But there's something about this place, something that sticks with you long after you clock out and head home. It's not just the machines beeping or the endless hustle of doctors and nurses moving from one patient to the next. It's the moments when things slow down just enough for you to notice the small, inexplicable details. The kind of things that linger in your mind, gnawing at you even when you try to push them away. It started with one nurse, a colleague I've worked with for years. Laura, her name was. Quiet, methodical, the kind of nurse who never let her guard down. She wasn't one for superstition, not even a little. But one night, she came to me during a shift, her face pale, her eyes wide with something I hadn't seen in her before, fear. She pulled me aside in the break room, away from the others, and spoke in hushed tones. "I saw it again," she said. At first, I thought she was talking about some patient complication or maybe a difficult procedure she'd been working through. But the way her hands trembled as she held her coffee mug told me this wasn't just another medical issue. "The figure," she clarified. "The one in the hallway." I remember feeling a chill run through me, but I tried not to show it. Laura wasn't the type to joke around. If she was telling me this, it wasn't some passing fantasy. She was serious. "It was standing there again, just like before," she continued, her voice shaking. "Right at the foot of the patient's bed. I saw it, clear as day, tall in a black cloak. And it wasn't just once. It happened 3 times last month. Every time right before one of our patients went into cardiac arrest. The moment I saw it, I knew." I didn't let her finish. I had heard rumors, whispers, but I never took them seriously. A figure in a black cloak, always just before someone passed away. It sounded like something out of a ghost story, the kind you tell when the lights go out and everyone's gathered around a campfire. But I could see in Laura's eyes that she wasn't making this up. She was shaken, and I could feel it in the air. There was something about her story that was too grounded, too real, for me to just dismiss it. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake her words from my mind. The hospital was quiet one night when it happened to me. My shift had been dragging on, and I was moving between rooms, checking on patients. As I walked down the hall, I noticed something strange. There was a shadow at the far end, right where the hallway bent. It wasn't the usual shadows you get from overhead lights or the shifting of curtains. This one was different. It was a solid dark mass, towering and still. I froze for a second. My heart skipped and I felt that old familiar prickle of dread running up my spine. But there it was, standing motionless, tall, cloaked, and just out of reach of the fluorescent lights. I swallowed hard, taking a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear the soft beeping of a patient's heart monitor down the hall. Then, as if some invisible force had given me a nudge, I turned and walked toward it, my legs feeling heavy, as though I was walking through water. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the figure. It felt like time was stretching, like everything around me had slowed down. I was frozen, but at the same time, a part of me was urging me to move, to leave. But my feet wouldn't budge. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. I ran to the room of the patient who had been nearby. His vitals were stable, nothing alarming. But the moment I stepped into that room, I knew. My gut told me the worst had yet to come. Later that night, the patient did go into cardiac arrest. Despite all our efforts, we couldn't bring him back. He was gone within minutes. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the figure standing there, watching. There were no cameras in the hallway that could confirm anything, no way to prove that what I had seen was real, except for the fact that the patient, just like Laura had said, didn't make it. That was the part that stuck with me the most. The eerie connection between the shadow and the patients who passed away. Over the following weeks, more of us began seeing it. Nurses who had been working here for years, those who had seen it all, started reporting similar experiences. It was always the same, the cloaked figure looming at the foot of a patient's bed just before their heart would stop. It wasn't just Laura anymore. It was Michelle who had seen it twice in 1 week. It was Karen who had witnessed it right before a young man went into a sudden arrest. The stories spread quietly at first, like rumors shared in dark corners of the break room, but none of us could ignore it. Now every time I walk those same hallways, I keep my eyes ahead. I don't look to the corners, don't glance into the shadows, even though I can feel them there, lurking just out of view. I don't know if it's a coincidence or if it's something more, something that's beyond the physical. But I've seen it, just like the others, and it's there, waiting. Some people call it the Grim Reaper, others call it something else entirely. But whatever it is, I don't want to meet it again. I've learned to trust my instincts in this job, and my instincts tell me one thing for certain. When you see it, there's no turning back. You know what's coming next, and you can only hope you're not the one it's watching. It's funny how in the ER you see so many things that at the time don't seem that unusual. There are so many people coming in, so many stories, so many lives hanging by a thread. You learn to keep your emotions in check. You have to, or you'd never survive the weight of it all. But sometimes there are moments that hit you harder than others. Not because they're big or dramatic, but because they're unsettling. Moments that leave you wondering, even long after the shift ends, if maybe, just maybe, there's something more to this life than what we can see and touch. It was a Wednesday evening, just as the shift was beginning to settle in. The waiting room was packed, and the steady hum of voices filled the air. I was checking on patients, running between rooms, doing what we do best, keeping things running smoothly, all while fighting the exhaustion creeping in. That's when he came in, an elderly man, his face pale with a thin sheen of sweat covering his brow. He looked fragile, the kind of man who had lived a long life, each year carved into the deep lines of his face. He was helped in by his son, a man in his late 40s, with the same weary expression, as if he too had lived a hard life. They explained that he had fallen at home, tripping over something in the living room. But as I helped the son settle his father into one of the ER beds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The man, whose name was Arthur, seemed to be more dazed than I would have expected for a simple fall. His eyes kept shifting, darting around the room like he couldn't focus on anything for too long. I could see the confusion clouding his gaze, his brow furrowed in discomfort. I took his vitals and began asking the usual questions. Where he was, if he had any chest pain, if he'd lost consciousness. But it wasn't the answers that caught my attention. It was the way he reacted when I asked him how he was feeling. "Why am I over there?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I froze. He didn't seem to be talking to me. His eyes, wide and unfocused, were staring at something beyond me, as though he was looking at someone, or something, standing in the corner of the room. "Arthur?" I said, trying to bring him back to the present. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" I turned around quickly, scanning the room, expecting to see someone, maybe a nurse or a doctor, but there was no one there. The hallway outside the room was empty. The only thing I could hear was the soft beeping of his heart monitor and the distant murmurs of the other patients. "Why? Why am I over there?" he repeated, his voice growing weaker. His eyes were glued to some invisible point, his hands trembling as he reached out in front of him, as if trying to grab onto something. I leaned in closer, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. "Arthur, look at me. Can you hear me?" He didn't respond. His eyes were glassy now, distant. It was like he was no longer aware of me standing there. His hand suddenly clutched at his chest, his breath growing shallow. I immediately hit the call button, rushing to his side, but it was already too late. In the split second it took for me to grab the defibrillator paddles, his heart stopped. I didn't even have time to properly react before his body went limp, his expression frozen in confusion, still lost in whatever world he had been seeing, still reaching for something that wasn't there. The room was silent after that. The air felt heavy, and I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights above us, almost too loud in the stillness. His son was outside, waiting for updates. He hadn't seen any of it, just the collapse. He came rushing in, his face full of dread. I had to tell him what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to mention the look on his father's face, how he had looked as though he was seeing something, someone, that no one else could see. Later, after the paperwork and the procedures were done, I sat alone in the break room, trying to calm myself. The incident had been odd, sure, but there were always odd moments in the ER, things that didn't quite make sense. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the question that kept running through my mind. What had Arthur seen? And then the thought hit me, the thing I hadn't dared to consider until now. Could it be that in his final moments, Arthur had seen himself? Could he have been looking at the version of himself that had already crossed over? The over there he was referring to. Was it his own death he had glimpsed before it happened? I've worked here long enough to know that there are things we can't explain, things that go beyond the realm of science and medicine. As much as I'd like to chalk it up to confusion from the fall or some kind of hallucination, part of me knew that there was something more to it. The way he'd reached out with such desperation, the confusion in his eyes, it didn't feel like just a medical episode. I kept asking myself, had he truly seen his own passing? Had his soul, in some strange way, known what was coming before the rest of his body did? The rest of the night passed and the usual routine continued. But I couldn't stop thinking about Arthur's last words. I couldn't stop imagining that moment when he saw himself over there, before his body finally gave in. It's strange, isn't it? How a single moment, a small, seemingly insignificant thing, can haunt you long after it's over. You wonder if there's something more out there, some other plane of existence, just beyond the reach of our understanding. And sometimes I think, maybe we don't see the full picture. Maybe we only get glimpses, just like Arthur did in the final seconds before he left this world. As I stood there in the ER, looking out at the quiet hallway, I couldn't help but feel a chill run through me. Not from the cold, but from something deeper, something that no one can explain. And I wondered if maybe there's more to life and death than any of us will ever understand. I've seen a lot in my years working in the ER. The wreckage that comes in after accidents, the young and the old, the lucky and the unlucky. I've gotten used to the rush, the adrenaline, the pressure, the life and death decisions that come every minute. But some things you can't quite shake off. Some things stay with you, lodged in your mind, long after the chaos settles. It was a Friday night when she came in. Her name was Emily, or at least, that's what her ID said. The paramedics had brought her in after a severe car crash. Her vehicle had rolled multiple times, and the damage to her body was clear from the way they had to carefully lift her onto the gurney. She was unresponsive, her face pale, blood streaking down the side of her head. A severe head injury, but nothing that seemed like it would instantly kill her. Still, the moment I laid eyes on her, something felt off, like a cold draft in the back of my mind. We rushed her into the trauma bay, and the usual triage began. As we worked, trying to assess the extent of her injuries, I noticed the odd, almost unsettling silence that hung over the room. The other nurses were moving, steady as always, but there was something about her presence. Still, too still, like the calm before a storm. I was checking her vitals when it happened. 1 second, she was lying there, unblinking, unresponsive. And then, as if something in her had clicked, her body jerked upright. Her back arched with unnatural precision, like she was a puppet suddenly given life. Her eyes, they were no longer the soft brown they'd been before. They were black, completely black. No whites, no irises, just dark, endless voids staring at nothing. I froze, my hand still on the machine, a sudden wave of unease rushing over me. I looked around, but the other nurses hadn't noticed. They were too busy, too focused on the task at hand. And then she spoke. It wasn't the sound of her voice that startled me, it was the tone. It was deep, so deep, as if it wasn't coming from her at all. The words sent a chill straight down my spine. "He's coming for you next." The room went still. The words hung in the air like smoke, dense and suffocating. I couldn't breathe for a moment, couldn't make sense of what had just happened. My eyes locked onto hers, and for a heartbeat, it felt like I wasn't looking at a person at all. It felt like I was staring at something otherworldly. Then, just as quickly as she had sat up, Emily collapsed back onto the gurney, her body going limp like a rag doll. The blackness in her eyes disappeared, and she was just gone. The monitors beeped erratically, and the other nurses, now noticing the disturbance, rushed to her side. I barely remember the next few minutes. There was a flurry of activity, trying to stabilize her, checking for any signs of life. The words she had spoken still echoed in my mind, and I felt a strange weight pressing on my chest. Who was she talking about? Who was coming for me next? Was this some kind of joke? Some side effect from the head trauma? We finally got her stabilized, and as the minutes turned to hours, she regained consciousness. Her breathing evened out, and her vitals became more steady. It was a relief, though the oddness of what had happened didn't leave my mind. I went in to check on her to see how she was doing after everything. Her eyes were back to normal, clear brown, soft even in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital room. I felt a wave of guilt for having thought anything unusual. She was just a patient, after all. She had been through a traumatic event, and people say strange things in moments of stress, don't they? But then I asked her the question I had to. "Emily, do you remember anything? Anything unusual when you came in?" She blinked at me, as if processing the question for the first time. A long moment passed, and she just shook her head slowly. "No," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I don't remember much. I was in an accident, wasn't I?" I nodded, not knowing how to respond. I didn't want to scare her, didn't want to sound like I was accusing her of something I couldn't explain. I left her room soon after, but the unsettling feeling lingered with me. I couldn't shake the thought of what she had said. "He's coming for you next." What did it mean? And why her? Why would a woman who had been through something as horrific as a car crash say something like that? The deep voice, the eyes that weren't hers, none of it made sense. It felt like something you read in a paranormal story, but it had happened to me, right in front of my eyes. Days passed, and Emily was eventually discharged. I thought about going back to check on her after a few weeks, to see if she was okay, but I never did. She never came up in conversation again, and I didn't ask any of my colleagues if they remembered her. But I can't forget the image of her sitting up, her eyes completely black, the chilling words that didn't seem to belong to her. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the break room or walking down those sterile hospital halls, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to hear that voice again. "He's coming for you next." But no one ever says anything. The ER is a place of constant urgency. a world that never stops. You're always on your toes, moving from one crisis to the next, making decisions in seconds that could mean the difference between life and death. The sound of a code blue blaring over the intercom is one we all know too well. It's the call you dread, the one that sends a jolt of adrenaline straight into your veins, pushing you into overdrive. I've been here long enough to know the drill. When that code blue hits, everything else stops. You don't think, you just move. You sprint toward the room, adrenaline surging, knowing that each second counts. But there's something about the code blue in room 12 that has stayed with me, something I'll never shake. It started on a slow night, the kind of night where the usual hum of activity in the ER settles into an almost eerie silence. We were all just going through the motions, checking charts, updating patient records, a little small talk in between the steady beeping of monitors, the kind of night where you almost forget how fast things can shift. Then the intercom crackled. Code blue, room 12. Code blue, room 12. It was a voice I didn't recognize, probably a new staff member doing the paging. But it didn't matter. The call itself was all that mattered. My heart jumped. Room 12? Room 12 hadn't seen a patient in years. It had been marked out of service, the walls cracked, the door slightly ajar, with a "Do Not Enter" sign taped crookedly to it. It was one of those rooms that had been forgotten, tucked away in the back corner of the ER. The hospital had plans to renovate it, eventually, but those plans always seemed to get pushed to the bottom of the list. I had heard rumors about the room, rumors about odd noises late at night when no one was around, but I'd always brushed them off. Still, hearing that call was unsettling. I glanced at the clock. The room was out of service. There couldn't be anyone in there. But when the code blue call went out, it didn't matter. We responded anyway. That's just how it works in the ER. You don't question, you just go. I was the first to reach the hallway outside of room 12, followed by Dr. Parker and Nurse Amy. We stood there for a second, staring at the door. I don't know why, but something in the air felt off. The lights flickered for a split second, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me pause. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Amy, but she just shook her head. The door was slightly ajar and we pushed it open. The room was empty, completely empty. I couldn't believe it. I stepped inside, looking around, my eyes scanning every corner, expecting to see a patient lying in a bed or on the floor, hooked up to monitors, struggling for life. But there was nothing. Just a dusty room with old, unused medical equipment sitting quietly in the corners, collecting more and more dust with each passing day. Confused, I turned back to Dr. Parker. He was already checking the monitor in the corner of the room, the one that tracked code blue calls. But it didn't make sense. The log didn't show anything either. According to the system, room 12 hadn't had a patient for over 5 years. There was no medical history, no records, no current staff working on anyone in that room. "What the hell?" Dr. Parker muttered under his breath. "There's no one here. No one's even been in this room for years." We checked the logs, double-checked the system, but everything was clear. Room 12 had been out of service for years, and there was no record of anyone, patient or staff, ever being assigned to it. Nurse Amy looked uneasy, but I could see her trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone entered the wrong code or hit the wrong button. But we both knew that wasn't likely. A code blue wasn't something that just got accidentally triggered. It had to come from a specific place, a specific room. It wasn't like a fire alarm or a faulty phone line. Suddenly there was a sound, a faint echo, a footstep. No, it was the soft sound of something scraping against the floor, barely audible. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind me, but nothing. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My skin prickled. We were still standing in the doorway, trying to make sense of it all, when I heard it again, faint but unmistakable, a low hum. It was coming from the back of the room. We all looked toward the far corner where the old machines sat, gathering dust, but there was nothing there. Just machines and chairs covered in sheets, as abandoned as the rest of the room. "Okay, let's just get out of here," Dr. Parker said, his voice suddenly sounding uneasy. "This isn't right." We turned to leave, but just as we did, I heard a soft thud, like something had fallen. We all spun around, but again, nothing. The room was still empty, silent. We walked back out into the hallway, trying to shake off the feeling. Amy grabbed the intercom system and placed a call to the front desk, asking for clarification on the code blue in room 12. She barely spoke a word before hanging up, her face even more confused than before. The front desk says there's no record of any call for room 12. It didn't make sense. A code blue had gone out for a room that didn't even exist in terms of patient care. Yet somehow we had all rushed there, responding to something that wasn't real. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept asking myself, what had triggered that call? What had caused us all to move toward room 12 as if it were just another emergency, when there was no emergency to be had? And the worst part, as the night wore on, we heard it again. The sound of footsteps, quiet just beyond the threshold of room 12. Soft, dragging, like someone or something was pacing back and forth in there. But when we checked, it was empty. Always empty. I don't know what happened that night, and to this day no one has ever explained it. Room 12 remains out of service, tucked away in the back corner of the ER, as it always has been. But sometimes, when the hospital is quieter than usual and the lights flicker just right, I find myself wondering, what was it that called us to that room? And what was it that was waiting there in the shadows just beyond the door? I still don't have an answer. But I know one thing for sure. There's something about room 12 that doesn't quite belong. And every so often, when the hallways are empty, I swear I can hear the soft scrape of footsteps just behind that closed door.